So in this video, I'm going to walk you through ABC Company while it compares the results of a simple costing system using a single traditional plant-wide rate to activity-based costing. So let's go ahead and turn to the workbook. ABC makes widgets and gadgets, but it started out as a widget company and it applied overhead on the basis of direct labor hours. That's always worked for it just fine, but then it added gadgets. Gadgets are a more complex product, and management didn't make the connection. They didn't realize that when they added a different, more complex product, they needed to add a different kind of costing to keep track of their costs. Now they're in a downward spiral. Sales of widgets are stalling and sales of gadgets are increasing. But management doesn't understand this. They were always the widget leader. They are positioned in the marketplace to be very efficient at making widgets, and they keep dropping the price to match the competition, but they can't quite drop it enough to keep the market share and make any money at widgets at all. At the same time, they don't feel very competent in making gadgets. They're new in the market, and yet sales are taking off. What's going on? They need to figure out what's going on. And so the management team is sitting around discussing this, and they decide to look at their traditional costing system as it stands now. So they've gathered this information. The number of units that they've budgeted for widgets is 750,000 and 240,000 gadgets. They've got the revenue, the direct materials, the direct labor hours, direct labor rate, and then the total indirect costs. And this is enough information to let us put together an informal income statement. So we've got the template here for an informal income statement. The revenue for widgets is the number of widgets that they're going to sell times the revenue per unit. The direct materials, of course, is the number of widgets that they're going to sell times the value of the direct materials per unit. And then the direct labor is the number of widgets that they're going to sell times the number of hours it takes to make one widget times the hourly rate. And I'm going to tap F4 here, and you can see that it put in the dollar signs in front of the E and the 9, and that makes it an absolute reference. I can copy those three items over, and now you look here and it still picked up E9. I can hit F2, and it moved the cells that did not have an absolute reference over to the right, but it picked up that absolute reference cell. I'm going to total these. Applied overhead, we need to figure out what's going on with applied overhead. So let's do a few calculations off here to the side. First of all, we remember that we need to create a POHR, predetermined overhead rate, and that's going to be estimated overhead divided by estimated driver units. And so my estimated overhead, that's pretty straightforward. That's 1,593. So the driver units in this case is direct labor hours, as it said in the first line. And that is going to be made up of two pieces. So let me put that in here as a formula. We're going to make 750 widgets at an hour each. That's part of that. And then we are also going to make 240 gadgets at 1.3 hours each. Now don't mistake that for an hour and 30 minutes. In Excel, we're using decimals, so that's actually 1.3 hours. And so that's 1,062 direct labor hours. And so my predetermined overhead rate, if I divide this out, is $1.50 per direct labor hour. And again, it's always a good idea to label your overhead rate so that you don't get them mixed up. And that becomes more important when we start working with activity-based costing and you have more than one rate based on more than one thing. We need to apply that overhead. So I'm going to take the number of widgets that we're making times the number of hours, and that gives me my number of direct labor hours. And then I can take that times my predetermined overhead rate. And again, I'm just going to make that an absolute reference so that I can copy this formula over, and then I can sum that. Now I can sum these rows. Remember, costs are subtracted from revenues. And so we have operating income. Even though the widget department is making a little bit more money than the gadget department, let's see what happens when we look at it on operating income per unit. So I'm going to take the $187,500 that the widget department made, and I'm going to divide that by the number of widgets. You can see we're only making 25 cents a widget. It is no wonder management doesn't feel they can drop the price anymore. And gadgets are making 55 cents a unit, so they're making a little bit more money. So this is our simple costing example using a traditional plant-wide rate, in this case of direct labor hours. Let's go on to activity-based costing. The management team has put together a team of people from different departments, different functions throughout the company. They've brought them in, they've explained activity-based costing and the benefits to them, and they've asked them to go out and find us more information. The first piece of information that they found was that because we have teams of people that work only on widgets and teams of people that work only on gadgets, there are quite a few costs that are actually traceable to widgets and gadgets directly that had been part of the overhead in the past. So for example, depreciation on equipment that is only used for widgets is actually traceable to widgets, and the same for gadgets. Or perhaps we have teams of people that work on cleaning up their own areas, and in the past we had charged that as indirect labor. Now it's considered to be a traceable expense. So we can start out by putting together the income statement for this example up to this point. So let's just look at this. Our revenue from widgets, it hasn't changed, right? It's exactly the same. So I'm going to go back to that old tab and I'm going to grab that revenue. And then I'm just going to copy that across and down. And so that is exactly what we had under the simple costing example. None of that has changed. What we do have now is we do have additional traceable costs of $100,000 for widgets and $235,625 for gadgets. We returned to our management team that found some more information. They found out that there is differences in the batch size and the setup time between each of these two activities, and they also determined the amount of costs associated with that activity. So widgets can be created in a batch size of 1,000 each, whereas gadgets require more precise working. The molds have to be cleaned more often. Whatever the case may be, they are created in smaller batches. Additionally, we are very efficient at setting up our machinery for widgets. We've been doing it for a long time. The setup time is only 2 hours, but we're still learning how to set up gadgets. Maybe our learning curve will change over time, but for right now, it's taking 3 hours to set up everything to produce gadgets. The total cost pool for setups is $663,000. We need to figure out how to adjust that. So the first thing we need is a predetermined overhead rate. So let's see how many batches. If we can make 750,000 widgets and we're going to put 1,000 in each batch, then that is 750 batches. Similarly, for gadgets, if we're going to make 240,000 gadgets and 200 per batch, then that is 1,200 batches. And so we can come up with a total setup time. We have 750 batches times 2 hours a batch. Means we're going to spend 1,500 hours setting up for widgets. 1,200 batches times 3 hours a batch is 3,600 hours. And so that is a total of 5,100 hours. My activity rate then will be the total cost in the cost pool, remember estimated overhead, divided by estimated driver units is going to be $130. And we can take these decimals out and make sure that that's an even 130, and it looks like it is. So now we have an activity rate. So let's go ahead and add setups to our income statement, or setup costs. Let's call it setup costs. For widgets, we're going to have 1,500 hours, and the activity rate is 130 per hour. You know, I didn't label that, so I probably should have said per setup hour here so that we know what we're talking about. And we can do the same thing for gadgets. We're going to have 3,600 hours times a rate of $130. And so my total cost is $663,000. And again, because we're applying this on the basis of budgeted numbers, in other words, our actual and our budget is the same, one of the ways you can check is to make sure that the two numbers match. The total amount applied is the total amount budgeted. If you're working with budgeted numbers and actual numbers, those two amounts will be different. So be careful. But in the planning phase, you can check it very quickly just to make sure that it ties out. Okay, we still haven't accounted for all of the overhead. So let's look at the information our ABC implementation team found out about machine hours per unit. Widgets take 1/4 of an hour a unit, and gadgets take 1.2 hours a unit, and the total costs assigned to the machine hour cost pool is $594,375. So let's go ahead and figure out the total number of machine hours used, and this is going to be by taking our widgets times our hours, and then we can copy that over for our gadgets, and we can sum that. So we're going to use a total of 475,500 machine hours during a year's worth of production. And our cost pool is there, so we can come up with an activity rate. And remember, the activity rate is estimated cost divided by estimated driver units, and we get $1.25 per machine hour. So now we're ready to add another overhead cost over here, and we're going to call it machine costs. We're going to take the number of hours that we use for widgets times that predetermined overhead rate, and we're going to take the number of hours we used for gadgets times that predetermined overhead rate, and then we can sum those. Now I think we're done with our overhead, but let's just make sure that it actually totals up. So I'm just going to add these three numbers together real fast, and you can see that the $1,593,000, we have accounted for all of our overhead. So now it's time to add our operating income row to this, and we're just going to take our revenue and subtract out each of the costs and bring that across. And now we can see a different story here. Widgets are actually making a lot of money. Remember, we had that cost per unit or operating income per unit, and we took the operating income and divided it by the number of units. And so we're actually making $1.04 a unit on each of our widgets. Now, we were having trouble dropping the price enough on these to match our competitors' prices because we thought we were only making 25 cents a unit, but we're actually making $1 a unit. And so our stalled sales are because we have overcosted them and therefore overpriced them. And we can reduce the price on the widgets and pick up some of that market share. Then maybe we can sell more again. And then let's go ahead and check and see what this is for gadgets. We're actually losing $1.93 per unit on gadgets. It's no wonder that we're selling so many of them. We have dramatically undercosted them and therefore underpriced them. We're pricing them lower than the competition, even though the competition has got better economies of scale and more industrial knowledge on how to make these gadgets. So we can compare these two side by side quickly. You can see that in our simple costing example, our total operating income was $319,500. And in our ABC costing example, it is exactly the same. We are not adding or subtracting any costs to this problem. We are only rearranging it. And so when you're in a business, you're not trying to change what things cost. You're just trying to put things into the correct bucket. And so by using your ABC, you get a much better idea of how much things are costing and how you can then price them to be more competitive in the marketplace. This concludes the video on activity-based costing.